In this video, we are going to solve this exercise. The first question says, write a basic implementation of Promise.all that accepts an array of promises and returns another array with the data coming from all the promises. Make sure if any of the promises gets rejected, throw error. Only when all the promises get fulfilled, resolve the promise. So here we are getting access to all the promises in the form of array. And what do we need to return from Promise.all? We need to return a new promise, right? So new promise accepts a callback function, and that callback function gets access to two functions, resolve and reject. Now, when do we need to resolve the promise? So to understand that, what we need to do first is to get access to individual promises from here, resolve that, put the data into an array, and once all the promises are resolved, we have to resolve the whole promise. So for that, we are going to write a for each loop because we have to loop over all the promises. So we'll say for each, we are going to get access to promise. And after getting access to promise, we need to wait for this to resolve. So here we have promise and we can say dot then, because using dot then, we can understand that the promise is resolved, right? So we can say when this promise is resolved, I will get access to data, and what I'm going to do with that data is to put this data into an array, because at last we have to return that array. So we can create that array here. We'll say final is an empty array, and here we can say final.push data. So we have pushed the data that we got in dot then. So this is the case when promise gets resolved. What is the case when promise gets rejected? If something goes wrong and the promise gets rejected, then we're going to call catch. Catch will get access to error message. And here what we need to do? So whenever the promise throws an error, we need to resolve the whole promise. So what we need to do here is to call reject with the message that we are getting. That is ERR. So whenever this promise is resolved, put that data into a final array. Whenever it is rejected, go ahead, reject the whole promise. Now, when we will resolve this promise, so right now we are resolving individual promises, we need to resolve the whole promise. So that case will happen whenever you are at the last promise. Say for example, you have your first promise, second promise, third promise, fourth promise. So first promise will result into a value 1, second will result into 2, third will result into 3, fourth will result into 4. So when all of these 4 got resolved into individual value, we will resolve the whole promise, right? So how we will know that we are at the end of it? We can use index to know that. So here the length of this promise and the index that we'll get from for each, like here, if they are same, it means you are at the end, right? So here I'll just put a condition by saying if promises dot length is going to be equal to index plus 1, because index is 1 less than the length. So we are going to say if that is the case, you have to resolve this promise with what value you have to resolve it with. So we have to resolve it with final. So we'll resolve it with final. So this is, in this way, I think we are done. So before testing, let's just review this, what we are doing here. So promise accepts a collection of promises in the form of array and returns a new promise. That new promise gets rejected whenever any of the promise from this promises array throws error, right? So reject is taken care of whenever all the promises is fulfilled. So this is how we are testing if all the promises are fulfilled or not. If that is the case, go ahead and resolve the promise. So let's go ahead and test it. So I'll copy this from here and we'll paste it here. Press enter, and what we will see is after 5 seconds, the promise will be resolved with a value of an array. And here we have all the values that these promises are being resolved to. So in this way, we are done with this. Moving on to next is convert the code below to use promises to do the following. So here if you look at it, what we are doing is we are using setTimeout function to pass a callback function, and this callback function will be called after 10,000 milliseconds. Here there is a concept called inversion of control. We are passing this callback and it will be called in future. We do not have any control on that. And that is the problem that Promise solves. So here I'm just going to write a function called promiseTimeout that will accept millisecond or time, that will accept time in millisecond, and this function will get resolved after that much of time. So we are going to return new promise, and here we need to pass a callback function. That callback function gets access to resolve and reject, and we need to resolve this promise after this many millisecond, right? So here we are going to use setTimeout, and after 10,000 millisecond we need to call resolve. So here we'll call the function resolve with a value of promise resolved. We don't have to pass anything, but we can pass just a message saying promise resolved after 10,000 milliseconds, and that is coming as ms. So this function is done. Now what we will do is we will go ahead, rewrite this code to use this function. So let us copy it from here and paste it in console. Now to use this, we'll have to call this function promiseTimeout that accepts time in millisecond. So that we are going to say 10,000 milliseconds. Whenever this promise is resolved, then we need to do something. And what is that something? We have to call this message. That is what we want. So rather than we passing it as a callback that will be called in future, we are just saying we are going to get access to response, and all we need to do is to call this function console log with the value 10 second passed. We press enter, and what will happen now is after 10,000 millisecond, the message 10 second passed will be printed here. And that we can see it here, 10 second passed. So we, rather than passing it as a callback to setTimeout, we are passing it to .then. So this is how you will rewrite this code. So I'll copy this here, copy this from here and paste it here. Moving on to next is make the line below log 1 and 2 rather than 2 and 1 using promises. You can only change one line of code. It means that you don't have to swap the line on top or bottom, because that will anyhow do it. So right now if you execute this code, you'll get 2 and 1, but we have to make it print 1 and 2. So how you can do that? So this code is a synchronous code. But what if I make this to be asynchronous code? Then this one will be just synchronous code and one will be printed first, and because this will become asynchronous, then 2 will come later on. And how can you convert any code into asynchronous? We know that promises are always asynchronous, right? So here what we can do is we can just wrap it into a promise, and we'll use resolve because we are resolving the promise at the same time. And whenever that is resolved, we are going to use .then. We'll get access to some information that we don't need. So we'll call it D, and here we just need to log it. So here we changed one line of code and wrapped them into a promises, and the second one we haven't touched it. Now if you just copy this code from here and paste it here, you will see that the output is 1 and 2. That is what we wanted, right? So important thing to understand here is console.log is a synchronous code. All we have to do is to make them asynchronous by adding things like promises because they're asynchronous. You can also use setTimeout, but here we are explicitly saying that you have to use promises. Moving on to next is convert the data given below into a promise, resolve it immediately and use .then to use the value to log it. So here we have a value. To convert it into a promise, all we need to do is to say promise.resolve. So a promise that can resolve at the same time, and the value that we are passing is user. And here we can use .then, we'll get access to response and we'll say console log. And all we can do here is we can directly say console.log. So to test it, we are just going to copy it from here and paste it. And here we can see that the promise is fulfilled, and in output we can see an object. Let's move on to the next one. So the next one says create a function named loadImage that can be used as follow. Using the following event listener like load and error to load the image, you can create an image element by using new image. Resolve the promise when the image is loaded and reject it if something goes wrong. So here we have a function loadImage that is getting access to URL. And what we need to do? The first thing we need to do about loadImage function is to return new promise. Promise needs a callback function. That callback function gets access to two things, resolve and reject. We need to resolve the promise. whenever the image is loaded, and we need to reject it whenever something goes wrong. So first we'll create an instance of image by saying new image, and here we'll add event listener. So we'll say image dot add event listener of type load. Whenever that is done, you just need to resolve the promise. So we'll say resolve, and we have to pass the image. Similarly, we're also looking for error on the image. If that happens, you have to reject it. So we have taken care of resolve and reject. The next thing we need to do is to add the URL. So we'll say image.src is going to be the URL. And I think we are done. That's all we need to do. So load image accepts the URL, returns a new promise, and here we are creating an instance of the image, adding a couple of event listeners of load and error. So whenever it is loaded, resolve it, otherwise reject it. And here how we are using it is we are saying load image with the URL, and we are using .then. So whenever it is loaded, we are going to get access to image. I'm going to append it into the body and log the width and height of the image. If something goes wrong, I'm going to log the message. So I'll copy this and we'll paste it here. After a couple of seconds, you'll see the width is 5472 and the height is 3646. So if we go down here, you will see that that image is right here. Can you see that? It is very zoomed in, so it doesn't look good, but you can just change the width of it, but it will work properly. So in this way, we have created our load image function using promises. Moving on to next is create a function named getFirstNamed that returns a promise. When the promise is resolved, it will return a value that is name aria. So we'll go ahead and start writing it because that will be easier. So we'll say let getFirstName is going to be a promise that is going to get resolved with a value of name that is going to be aria. Similarly, we are going to have second promise that is getLastName that is going to resolve with another object that will be similar. But the difference is here name is aria, here name is stock. What we have to do now is to create another function. So we'll go ahead, create another function which returns a promise. So we are going to return a new promise. And when the promise is resolved, it will return the full name that you will get by resolving the promise from the above two functions. So we have to resolve these two promises, and only when they are resolved, we have to return something from here. So whenever you have to handle multiple promises, the simplest way would be to use Promise.all. So here we'll get access to the data and we'll pass an array and we'll pass both these promises. So once the Promise.all will be executed, it will give us access to an array, and each element of the array is going to be an object with the value name aria and name stock. So here we'll get access to an array with two values, that is name aria and name stock. So we're going to use .then. We'll get access to response, and here response is going to be an array. So I'll get access to aria and stock from here. So we'll say return response.map, because from there all I need is aria and stock. So we'll get access to an object, and from that object I just need to return name. So finally what we are returning from here is going to be an array with aria and stock. And to make it simple, here we can just use .join with a space. So first name and last name can be joined. And here, rather than returning it, what we can do, we can store it into a variable called full name. So now we have a variable full name that has full name, that is we are getting from getFirstName and getLastName. Now what we can do is we can get access to resolve, and we can resolve this promise by saying resolve it with the value of full name. And whenever this is resolved, we can just use .then to it, right? So here we can just say, we can just call get full name, and we can use .then. We'll get access to response, and we're just going to say console log. So we'll say console.log. So now to test it, we're just going to open console, copy this code from here and paste it here. And here we can see the output is aria stock. So it is working properly. All I wanted to do with this exercise is to make you understand what are the different situations where you can use promises. So we started from The first one, that is to re-implement Promise.all, that we did it here. Moving on to next, we converted setTimeout to use promises. And here we can clearly see how promises can make our life a lot more easier by resolving the inversion of control. Then we used Promise.resolve to make this line of code asynchronous in nature, so it can just print 1 and 2. Here we converted this data into a promise and we used it using .then. We created another utility function called loadImage that is going to load the image, and it is only going to resolve when the image is loaded. And at last we used multiple promises inside a function getFullName, and that is going to give us a full name of the user.